Hello and welcome back to my channel. In my previous video, I built up a small Flutter application that connects to a cloud application in AWS via the API Gateway. So it can send location data that it gets from the GPS of the device, and it can retrieve the same data back and show it onto a map. So right now, all this information is accessible to everyone. Right? So the API gateway is basically a door, and this door is wide open and everyone can walk through it, write data into it, or retrieve all the data from it. Of course, that's not what I want. So in this video, I will show you how to add the protection to the API gateway so only logged in users can retrieve their own data from that service. AWS provides a service for this, and it's called Cognito. So let's add this service to our slide first. At the heart of Cognito is a user pool, which is basically a list of the authorized users. On top of the list of users, Cognito provides a whole range of use cases to manage this user pool, add new users, resend passwords, check credentials, log in, log out, get information on these users. What you will need to do in the API gateway is to add a verification step to check that the request is sent authorized by a user in the user pool. To do this, you have to add an authorizer to your API gateway. This authorizer is basically connected to a user pool, and it can be integrated into each of the functions or methods you have set up in your API gateway. That way, for each request any of your methods get, before they execute the associated Lambda function, they will check against the authorizer with the credentials given in the request. The authorizer checks against the user pool whether the authorization token is valid, and reverts back to the method in the API gateway prior to the execution. What it also does is it can get additional information on a user from that user pool. So for example, you get a request from anywhere in the internet and you get an authorization token. This authorization token is not only checked whether it's a valid authorization, but it can also get you additional information on that user, for example, an address or an email. And this information can be mapped into the request, into the Lambda function, and that way you can retrieve only data for this specific user or write data in the context of this user. You can see the API gateway as a door to the internet, and you add a lock to each of the doors. Now what this also means is every request needs to come with a key that fits to the door. The key comes in the shape of an authorization token that fits into the lock, meaning it can be validated by the authorizer that it's a valid authorization token signed by Cognito for this user pool. And it means basically this access is authorized by that user in that user pool. The authorization token is handed over in a header field of the HTTP request. So your Flutter application needs to get an authorization token prior to calling any API gateway that requires authorization. These authorization tokens are issued by Cognito itself, so they are requested by the Flutter application from Cognito, not from the API gateway. Cognito issues these authorization tokens via an app client that is associated with the user pool. Each app client is set up specifically for each application, and one user pool can support multiple app clients. That way you can use one user pool to log into multiple applications, but each application has exactly one app client. The app client provides a range of endpoints that can be called by the application. The endpoints provided by the app client are defined by the OpenID Connect standard, and they provide functionality like login or close a session, sign up as a new user for your application. One of the key requests that are provided by the app client are, for example, to log in. So the application provides a username, password, and gets a token in return. Another feature Cognito provides is a connection to other standardized OpenID Connect identity providers. For example, Google or Facebook, and that provides a functionality that you can log into your application with your Google ID. So what are the steps that we need to do to implement this? Step 1 is we need to set up the user pool in Cognito. Step 2, which is basically a part of the user pool setup, is to define an app client that will be called by the application. The integration with additional identity providers is optional, and I will add that in a later video. In the API Gateway, I need to define an authorizer, which is connected to this user pool. For each of the methods of the API Gateway, I need to specify which authorizer to use, which basically sets up the lock in front of the door. It also specifies where to find the key. In my Flutter application, I need to add the authorization token to each of the requests to the API Gateway. I also need to add the functionality to the Flutter application to log in the user using username and password to get the authorization credentials that are required to call the API gateways. My Flutter application will require screens to provide your username and password or to sign up as a new user. In this example, I will use a static hard-coded username password for now and will replace that with the screens later. Let's start with setting up the user pool in Cognito. I'm now logged into AWS in Cognito and I'm creating a new user pool. I step through all the settings in detail. Log in via username, not via email. Everything for the demo just as basic as possible. Minimum length of or strength of password. Users can sign up themselves. No MFA. No recovery of passwords. No verification of email or phone number. No tags required. No user device tracking. An app client I will need. I disable the generation of client secret because the package I'm using seems to have some challenges with managing the client secret. If you generate a client secret, every request needs to have that client secret hash and it needs to be verified, otherwise the request will be rejected. No trigger functions, so here you can customize some functionality upon sign up or authentication for emails, for statistics, for example. So here my user pool was created. Now I need to verify the app integration settings. I will need a domain for this. I don't need any customization of the UI. In the app client settings, this is very important. Here I get the ID, that I need to use in my code later. And here I need to configure the callback URLs that need to be handed over for every call on the hosted UI authentication. Now these URLs need to be HTTPS, so you cannot leave the signed or secured environment over SSL, and they can be basically anything as long as it's HTTPS. I use implicit grant, email, OpenID. So with all this configured, I can use the hosted UI to create a user for test purposes. Now that we have set up the user pool in Cognito, I will set up the authorizer in the API Gateway and add it to the existing methods. In the API Gateway, I have a section here for Authorizers, and I create a new authorizer. I use a Cognito authorizer, and I specify the pool that I just created. Important fields here are token source. For token source, authorization is the de facto standard. So that's the name of the field in the header, and I strongly recommend to use it as authorization. Token validation is optional, so right now I will not be using that. So my authorizer has been created and it's connected to the locations pool that I just set up. There is a little bug in the interface, so after setting up the authorizer, I need to go out of this section and get back into my API. Otherwise, I cannot see this authorizer where I need to select it. So now when I go to my method, in this case log list get, I can go in the step prior to execution of the Lambda function. So here it's a Lambda function execution. Prior to that, authorization can be checked. And after authorization is verified, mappings can be executed. So next step is go to authorization, and here I can now select the authorizer I just created. Same I do for the put request. And when I deploy this API now, it will not be accessible anymore. And I get the message unauthorized. Next thing I want to do is I want to map the user ID into the request for the get locations. Previously, the user could send the user ID with his request, but that of course means user A can just claim to be user B and get his data. So now I want to derive the user ID from the authorization token. That is done here in integration request. So in the mapping template, previously I mapped into user ID the input params, which I'm getting from the request. And instead of taking the user ID from the input, I will take it from the context. So context authorizer is where I get information from Cognito. Same for the put function. And now all changes to the API are deployed. Before we implement the access in Flutter to the user pool, I want to verify that the setup is correct. So for that, I use the hosted UI to create a user and try the access. I need to verify the user before I can use it to log in. So I go to users and groups and I see the new user unconfirmed. Now actually the page has a defect, so I need to leave the user pool and get back into it in order to see it. So now I can click on the user, confirm it, and now the user is confirmed and I can try to log in with that user. Going back to the hosted UI, this is the URL used to call the hosted UI. So HTTPS location list is the domain we created under Amazon Cognito. Login is the endpoint. We give the client ID of our user pool client. And response type is set to token. Check that it's not set to code, because if it's set to code, you get a code, but you want a token to test the access. So now I'm redirected to Google as specified. I copy paste the URL and let's have a closer look at that one. We're being redirected to Google as specified, and as a fragment we are being handed over a couple of tokens. So we have an ID token and we have an access token, as well as some expiration data. What we need is the ID token. This is the ID token, and I copy this one. I go to the API Gateway. Going to the authorizer I have set up using this Cognito user pool, and I can test it. I paste this token, this ID token, not the authorization token, and I get this response. So I get additional data as specified for this user, the email I used to sign up, and it shows that this token is valid. I see authorization must be specified in the header, and that's what I can use in VS Code now. Before we go to VS Code to implement the Cognito functionality into our Flutter application, let's go to pub.dev and see what kind of packages are already available for the Cognito integration in Flutter. I had already been searching and comparing a couple of packages, and I came to the conclusion that I want to work with Amazon Cognito Identity Dart 2. There is an official Amazon Cognito package that uses Amplify, which I don't want to use. Let's have a quick look at the details. It's very popular, got a lot of likes. Installation is very straightforward, can be handled automatically by VS Code. It comes with a couple coding examples that provide use cases that we will be using. Sign up is one of the critical ones. Authenticate user gives you a session, Cognito user session, or a whole range of exceptions. Get user attributes. Changing password. Forgot password. Confirm password. Delete user. Sign out. and it also provides functionality to persist the user session on the device. Here I'm in VS Code. I have installed the package Amazon Cognito Identity.2, and I'm importing a couple of files from that package. The user pool with the configuration that I copy-pasted out of Amazon, a function to log in with hard-coded user credentials. So here I have user queue, which I just set up. After login, I saved the session. From this session, I can retrieve the ID token. My class HTTP loader had already the functions HTTP GET and HTTP PUT set up that call the API Gateway. Now the API Gateway is protected, so what I need to do is I need to add the authorization field in the header, and it needs to contain the ID token. So here I add the header in HTTP GET as well as in HTTP PUT authorization token as an additional header field. Now I need to get that token first, and for that I have created a function getIDToken, and that, very simply put, it calls a login function that right now uses hard-coded credentials and retrieves getIDToken, JWT token, and returns that. Let's run this application and check in parallel what it does to the database. I have started the application, and in parallel I'm opening up the locations table in Dynamo DB, and I see it right now has 5 entries, 5 users. 4 I used previously with my testing, and 1 with an ID that is a test user generated by Cognito. So now that my app is running here, I have not done anything, I have not logged in yet, but it's using the user queue credentials which have not logged in yet. So by pressing the button, it has logged in and it has put the first position into the database. So let's reload what we see now in the database. So now I see an additional new item here, new user with the user ID as a string, as a code, and I see the entries. So with that I have protected my API gateway using Cognito, and I have created the basic functionality in Flutter to retrieve the ID token after the login in Cognito and hand it over in the calls to the API gateway to access the data.